And that's definitely how you'll become the next it girl. Bella Hadid will be quaking in her boots when she sees the
Wow,
way you
slay, these
slay.
OMG,
Follow
I
me
was
for more
literally
culturally
looking for these
relevant
exact
information on
tips.
how
This
to
is
be the
kind
next
of
it
cringe,
girl.
lol. Cringe? Me? Gen Alpha thinks I'm cringe? I can't be cringe. My entire personality is perfectly tailored composition of whatever's trending on TikTok and slang ripped from AAVE and queer culture that I pretend I came up with. I can't be cringe. What do I do? What do I do? I guess I could just stop doing this series. Yeah, if Gen Alpha thinks that's embarrassing, I'll stop saying it. And then I'll be cooler for longer. Yeah, that's the move. That's exactly how this is supposed to go. But what about when Gen Alpha grows up? Will I be uncool then? How will I be able to sustain this? Wait. There's a way. Beep 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 beep. Brr, 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 brr.
Hey Hans, oh my god, it's been so long.
Hey, yeah, okay. Are you still pregnant?
Yeah, I still am. Why?
Can I talk to the baby?
What? Are you serious?
Just lower the phone and let me talk to the baby. I really need to talk right now.
Okay, fine.
Hey, I really need some advice right now. How do you think I can not be cringe?
Well, personally, I think it's really embarrassing when people communicate at all. Like, it's so cringe when people have an opinion. Like, just float around.
Oh my
and call me out
god,
of
my
sack like I
baby's
do.
first
Head
words.
empty and
So that was an interesting skit, but truly that's what it started to feel like when I went on TikTok and started to see people talk about what's cringe to Gen Alpha, even though most of them are currently under 14. In one specific instance, I remember seeing a mom ask her middle-aged child, her middle school going daughter, who couldn't have been older than like 12, and mom asked her like what she thought was cool, what's cringe right now, and what words Gen Alpha don't like, and she was taking this feedback really hard. Like, apparently saying slay is cringy to Gen Alpha, and the mom was like, well, I guess we can't say slay anymore because it's cringy. And I was just like, you're her mom. To her, whatever you say is going to be cringe. So it's like, why worry about being cringy or not to someone who's gonna think you're cringy anyway? Plus, I was like, you're a grown adult, like this shouldn't matter to you anyway. And then I scrolled past the video and I saw other videos of people talking about how cringy millennials are. And then when I scrolled past that one, there was a TikTok of millennials making fun of Gen Z and being like, oh, they're trying to take away our side parts from us. And it's just like, what is going on? Why do all of these people care about this? Why is being cringe such a horrific thing to us? And why does it seem like it varies from generation to generation? So thinking of that question, I started to research, and this video is a result of all of that research. So let's begin. Okay, this part is going to feel a little bit like a high school essay, but I believe if we understand the anatomy of cringe, then maybe our understanding of what's even going on here in the first place will make a little more sense holistically. So, what is cringe? In Old English, the word cringen meant to fall, to yield in battle, to become bent, and to curl up. And it was this way for a few centuries before the 16th century, when cringen became cringe and it began to be used to describe feelings of fear, of embarrassment, rather than bending or crouching. Was this because feeling embarrassed sometimes does feel like you're literally bending your head, yielding in a social battle, or failing socially? Perhaps. But by the 19th century, the word had fully begun to embrace the meaning that we identify with it today, which is to recoil in embarrassment, fear, or shame. And if it still isn't clear what exactly cringe means here, then here's a quote from a 1978 article by a journalist talking about why she prefers the company of her dog to people. And I will be quoting, "He's not ashamed to be seen with me in front of his friends, and he doesn't cringe when I get too loud at a party." I would say relate to this, but my cat definitely cringes when I get too loud. And then she just doesn't want to hang out with me anymore. So safe to say, we've been using cringe the way we do today for quite a while now. After some time, we also started to use cringe to refer to a kind of secondhand, vicarious embarrassment, which according to Roland Miller, a psychology professor at Sam Houston State University in Texas, is a mild embarrassment or chagrin that occurs when somebody empathizes with or imagines oneself in the place of another person who is doing something potentially embarrassing, like when you watch someone on stage forget their lines. Now, vicarious embarrassment, or what cringe has turned into, activates the part of our brain associated with our emotions and our ability to understand what other people are feeling, and areas that are associated with pain and arousal in general. According to Dr. Laura Müller-Pinsler, a postdoctoral researcher at University of Lübeck in Germany who has studied embarrassment extensively, she says that this emotion often means sharing another's shame, which means that people can begin to feel embarrassed for someone who's unaware that they're making others feel this way. This network that activates when we cringe, according to Dr. Müller-Pinsler, also involves the so-called mentalizing network, which activates when we try to understand what other people are thinking. She says, "We care so much what others think of us, and embarrassments cause such chagrin that we can come to be mildly distressed by witnessing other people in embarrassing circumstances if we're nice, sensitive people who understand others' feelings." Maybe Dr. Müller-Pinsler wasn't specifically referring to cringe in the last part there, but just to the root emotion that might lead to it. This according to Melissa Dahil, a senior editor at The Cut and author of a book known as Cringeworthy: The Theory of Awkwardness. I actually read this book for this video, so this is how she puts what I'm describing. Empathy is often an automatic human process. Someone who really enjoys cringe content is probably also a highly empathetic person, but I don't necessarily mean a kind person. See, at its roots, and when we look at evolutionary history, cringe is just a byproduct of our fear of social rejection, which, since we're an ultra-social species, can almost feel as intense as physical pain. Perhaps this is why kringen, the word that led to the development of cringe, also led to the development of crinkle, because we literally do crinkle our faces when we're embarrassed. Or as Dr. Miller puts it, we do this because the ability to feel vicarious embarrassment or cringe is influenced by our ability to empathize with others. We cringe not only because we find something uncool, but also because we are compassionate and may have experienced a feeling similar to what we're watching. Cringe's roots in secondhand embarrassment may also mean we feel empathetic. It may just be a conditioned, instinctual, physical response to public shaming that we're witnessing someone else about to go through or is going through. So we understand what cringe traditionally means. But let's take this a step further, because to understand the cultural environment in which internet was shaping the way we know cringe today, we need to take a look at the entertainment that was planting the seeds for this to happen. When cringe was first introduced on the internet in the late 2000s and in the 2010s, a lot of popular entertainment focused on entertaining its viewers through scripted comedy designed to make them basically cringe. For example, shows like Curb Your Enthusiasm, which is basically just a bunch of awkward, cringy misadventures. Or take the American remake of The Office, which was initially about The Office's socially awkward boss, Michael Scott, who was so desperate for approval and so cringy it almost made him somehow endearing. These shows were very popular, but for The Office specifically, it was so popular that it inspired so many similar sitcoms in the same format and with the same cringy yet endearing central character. When the show finally ended, its director Ken Kwapis said, and I will be quoting, "You didn't hear words like cringeworthy or cringe-inducing in a complimentary way before the show. Now I go to pitch meetings where executives say, I want that cringeworthy comedy." People loved cringe, so much so that little hubs to showcase it began to pop up all over the internet, like cringeworthy.com, which was a website devoted to documenting cringy fails, and also on 4chan's random forum, where people first started discussing cringe that ridiculed people who they didn't like and those who didn't understand their ironic sense of humor. And also another hub was on YouTube. This is because when the site first came into existence, a lot of the people posting on here didn't seem to fully grasp the fact that they were broadcasting themselves to literally everyone. But the true place of our current cringe culture on the internet was Reddit. Surprise, surprise! In 2012, Michael Dumpkowski created the first cringe-specific forum called R Cringe after he watched this specific clip.
But this could be any school, and with any school come the cliques too. Cheerleaders, nerds, jocks, and goth. But lately, we've tailed another group on and off campus, literally.
We're not to be feared.
It's not emo, and it's not goth. It's, well, more animal than that. Meet members of the Wolf Pack, one of several packs scattered about San Antonio's north side.
We're not a gang at all. Like, gangs are posers. They just want attention. That's why they go on tagging stuff. The pack, we're family. Like, we go to see each other for our problems.
And yes, they sometimes meet under a full moon. That is, if mom and dad let them out of the house.
We're here. Yeah.
And can I just say about this clip, I love that the people have always been doing weird things. And yeah, these kids might have been funny to look at then, but you know, I hope they're all living great lives because they probably felt a sense of freedom acting like wolves in high school when I feel like you have to have so much confidence to do that in high school. So good on them, and I hope they're living very fulfilling adult lives. But anyway, Domgowski found that he literally could not sit through this clip and he had to hit pause multiple times and force himself to keep watching. So in response to that, he created our Cringe forum as a hub for all clips like this, and then he basically set up this little feed that would alert him whenever anyone on Reddit commented about something being hard to watch or embarrassing. Then he'd encourage the poster to share the video, the clip, on our Cringe instead. This helped him grow the subreddit to over 1 million members. He even began to teach the Cringe subredditors what the word meant and established hard boundaries on what exactly it was supposed to be. He said, and I will be quoting, "In the early days, we would get a lot of people posting stuff that just didn't really match what I was looking for, or people who would post videos of people breaking bones, or like gross out stuff. So when he started to make these hard rules on what exactly could be posted on the subreddit, he also began to ban people who were sharing clips of children or leaving comments on cringy YouTube videos and telling the posters of them to basically off themselves. He said, "It really bothered me. I always saw these videos as an empathetic exercise. It was always like, oh, I could totally see myself doing this, or it just felt like one of those nightmares where you're at school with no pants or something. It just fills you with a dread for that person." Side note, the people who were banned from our Cringe actually went on to create another subreddit called our Cringe Anarchy, which became hate-filled and essentially a far-right forum that was so toxic and encouraged violence to such a degree that it actually got taken down by Reddit, which I heard is pretty hard to do, so that must have been a pretty toxic place. Cringe culture online was born in the same year that so many of our now mainstay social media platforms were in their infancy stages. Both YouTube and Reddit were formed in 2005 and Twitter was formed in 2006. So this one is more of a personal theory as to why cringe flourishes so well on the internet, but I think because of how cringe really drives engagement, and so many people were just uploading endless amounts of uncurated content at the time on these platforms because they weren't really worried about their digital footprint or other people seeing what they were posting. There was a lot of supply of cringy videos, which probably got more engagement because people were sharing them around or showing each other these videos. And to quote Taylor Lorenz, a journalist who said something similar in his article in 2019, and I will be quoting, "For a social platform to successfully grow, it must reach the confused parents, the people who don't quite know when the camera is recording, the ones who get a little too personal or who aren't Instagram influencer attractive but have the gall to put themselves out there anyway." Things like this might have caused for the algorithm to learn that suggesting these kinds of videos, which might have had specific traits that caused people to think they were cringy, could have led to more people staying on these websites. And so it might have started pushing out more of these videos onto people's feeds and homepages. This is also why I think so many of the initial viral videos on YouTube, Twitter, and Reddit, so many of them were actually considered cringy. This was a time when cringe comedy coincided with the rise of a new public digital space that used the humiliation of the people posting content on it as a form of currency for the capital of people's attention, and this completely changed the way we approach cringe. However, I think as time went by and more people started to use these websites, the distance between the video poster and the people consuming these videos began to grow. And so the way we dealt with these cringy reactions also changed. Perhaps this byproduct of being terrified of social rejection and exclusion led us to reject anything that we culturally deem as bad, or may hold components of the patterns that our brain identifies as being considered considered socially as cringe. Perhaps our need to distinguish things as cringe comes from our own coping mechanism to deal with our own insecurities or self-hate, or even memories of our own failures and times we were socially rejected. Maybe it's a weapon we now wield to punish those who deviate from our social norms in a way that reminds us of our own potential to do so. Because the empathy that was once part of cringe culture, or like Dumpkowski mentioned, it could happen to me or has happened to me factor, is more difficult to now get to because the position of the viewer and the subject are so uneven. When we're watching these videos and cringy instances, we're analyzing them in real time against our own misadventures and critiquing them the same. Our self-censorship then removes our own empathy, which causes for this position between the viewer and the poster of the video to become uneven, like I mentioned before. And the potential for this to happen becomes more and more common as more and more people begin to consume that content, and the amount of people who actually know the poster becomes smaller and smaller until it's almost negligible. For online spaces like YouTube, Twitter, and Reddit, where basically anyone can come up on your main screens, it was a perfect place for cringe to develop into what it is today culturally because of this context collapse. We don't know this person who is saying something in this public forum that's going to be received in a way that is completely different from what they're planning or hoping for. Sometimes the way it's received is so bad that it can make the watcher of these videos angry, make them feel like they're better than the person posting, or make them feel like the person posting must be shamed so that they do not repeat this offense. So it's almost like we used to cringe because we were able to understand what the poster was going through and what they were feeling, but now we cringe because we can't believe that someone would do what the poster is doing or did. This is how journalist Caleb Madison put it as in his article for The Atlantic. Our instinct to cringe reinforces the new norms of online social behavior on a bodily level. With a new form of public space, the virtual, comes the navigation of new social norms, and consequently, new ways to be humiliated. Our instinct to cringe reinforces the new norms of online social behavior on a bodily level. The proliferation of online public embarrassment necessitates a new informal way to describe it, and in skulks cringe, a word already well suited to express instinctual contortions of public shame. Another perspective is that people might be drawn to cringe content because it does the same thing to our brains as nightmares do. As Melissa Dahl, who I mentioned earlier, puts it, it's our brains giving us a dose of exposure therapy. Maybe the same thing is happening for people who are drawn to cringy content. Maybe they're people whose deepest fear is being ostracized or made to look like a fool. The journey of cringe turning from a word used to describe social submission to one identifying vicarious embarrassment is, according to journalist Samia Kalia, the story of a Russian doll that looks a lot like you and me. Because according to her, social media truly becomes a prison for cringe to thrive into a rainbow of meanings. It was an adjective such as a cringe dress, a verb, I'm cringing at her song, a noun, stop writing cringe, and even an interjection. We cloak that cringe with shame, then with comedy, and with an infraction so severe that shan't be committed. And now, with the biggest piece is one of acceptance. Lurking underneath it all is still that cringe, that sense of public shame, but now it's how we grow around it. Okay, so we understand cringe, but how does that apply to the generational war I was talking about in the beginning of this video? Let's find that out, shall we?
Youth culture and the generational divide.
As eternal and instinctive as our current relationship with youth feels like, it actually only came into our lexicon in the early 1940s, which also happened to be when marketers discovered that you can make a fortune by marketing things to teenagers. And this ended up happening because the 1940s was the first time where a majority of 14 to 17-year-olds were actually in high school. Because if we go back to just a few decades to like the 1910s, we'd see that only 14% of 14 to 17-year-olds were in high school because most of the other ones were working and earning money for their families. But by the 1940s, the percentage of teenage schoolgoers in high school had increased to 73%. And so for the first time, there was a brand new social space that developed between adulthood and childhood. And this brand new demographic was termed as youth. Then by the time 1955 rolled around, 84% of 14 to 17-year-olds were in high school, and youth as an idea kept developing as subsequent college enrollments also began to increase. In fact, it actually doubled between 1956 and 1969. And suddenly, the term youth increased from the initial 4 years of high school to then 8 years to also include the traditional amount of time that people were in college for. And so, when 1969 rolled around, it was normal to be able to group the values, style, and taste of young people because we were actually able to term what youth meant here from a purely marketing perspective, which definitely might have bled into how we talk about youth in general even today. But I think that's a topic for another video. At this time, it actually made sense for the focus of marketers to be on the youth because at the time, half of the American population was under the age of 25. However, today, most of the American population is not under the age of 25. In fact, only around less than a third of the population, still youth as a consumer base, and also as something to aspire towards, still remains as a very, very big marketing tool across every entertainment platform like social media, smartphones, apps, streaming services, music, computer games, fashion, and every consumer product. Because of how profitable it is, there's a lot of motivation for companies to keep targeting youth. And so to help these marketing consultants and industry professionals understand how they can market to this youth, we've invented the current day concept of generations as we know it, so that we can occasionally redefine youth and youth culture and understand how we can market to them. Also, marketing towards youth and those who aspire towards it is a very lucrative and super profitable market. If everyone wants to be like this fraction of the population, it incentivizes marketers to keep the barriers to that population very, very strict, and also causes them to come up with even more reasons as to why people should aspire towards that limited, fleeting, and very profitable idea of youthfulness. So, okay, we understand youths, but that being said, did we just not think about generations before? Like, is this all just a current marketing concept? Well, not exactly. See, we did think about generations before, but it was very different to how we think about them today. Like when we look at the traditional human kinship structure with parents, and siblings, and children, we define the older generation as the parents, their siblings, or our aunts and uncles, and the younger generation as each of their distinct offsprings and their or our cousins. On an average for a species, it takes about 30 years for their younger generation to be considered as the older generation, but also that's specifically for humans because this is very dependent on species. Like for fruit flies, it literally only takes 10 days for the younger generation to become the older generation. So if we counted humans like that, all of us, except for 10-day-old babies, would be considered as fruit fly, as ancient elders. And now the next part is definitely taken from Wikipedia. I'm so sorry to all high school teachers who always warned against using Wikipedia. I had to use it here. Honestly, before the 19th century, we didn't really think about generations the way we do today. In 1863, Émile Littré, a French lexicographer, which is basically someone who compiles dictionaries, said that a generation is all men living more or less at the same time, which would make both me, my 80-year-old neighbor, and the newborn baby who lives like 2 doors down from me, all part of the same generation. Actually, scratch that. I'm not a man, so it would probably only make my 80-year-old neighbor part of a generation, and I would just not be considered at all, I guess. It was the French and German philosophers, according to sociologist Karl Mannheim, anxious to find a general law to express the rhythm of historical development based on the biological law of the limited lifetimes of man. But this idea of social generations truly came to fruition thanks to young people living in European cities in the late 19th and early 20th century. Multiple movements at the time involved focusing on the power of youth and its political influence. This include movements like Young Italy, Italy, Young Germany, and the German youth movement. And I will say, a lot of these movements were pretty controversial and led to some terrible historical events occurring. See, these young intellectuals wanted some way to explain why their own era-defining pursuits in philosophy, politics, and creativity were important, special, and distinct from those who came before them, and that they helped progress society forward. They theorized that it was the youth that had the power to build, shape, and revolutionize civilizations. They believed every generation could progress society, and since at the time they were the youth, they would do it now. Here's an extract from the Futurist Manifesto, written by Italian poet Filippo Tommaso Marinetti. I'm so sorry about the pronunciation, which explains it quite well. The oldest amongst us are not yet 30 years old. We have therefore at least 10 years to accomplish our task. When we are 40, let younger and stronger men than we throw us in the waste paper baskets like useless manuscripts. I have no idea what accent that was. I feel like I was trying to pull Hollywood, where they just have any European person historically just have a vague sort of English accent. I also do feel like it's necessary for me to note here that the Futurist Manifesto, while advocating for the youth, was also pro-war and wanted to get rid of museums, libraries, fight morality, feminism, and in the words of the translation I read on Wikipedia, all utilitarian cowardice, which is pretty much not very fun if you aren't like a tiny fraction of the population. And also the guy that wrote it also signed the Fascist Manifesto, which supported and justified the violence perpetuated by the fascist dictator Benedict Mussolini. So he wasn't exactly a great figure in Italian history. Anyway, back to where we were. All of these changes and these movements were also happening at a very interesting period of time for young people. A lot of huge economical changes were happening, like modernization, industrialization, and westernization, which brought about social and economical mobility that enabled a lot of young people, specifically young men at the time, have more control over their futures, be less obligated to follow their father's footsteps, what their families expected from them, and their authority. Also, because of all this technological and social change, the wisdom of the elder people in their family didn't really fit or help them, which also means that they developed values away from their elders and helped spread the idea of the power of youth. And this made scientists, sociologists, and philosophers at the time pay more attention to generations, with Auguste Comte being one of the first philosophers to make note of it, when in his book Cours de philosophie positive, he suggested that, and this part I had to quote from Wikipedia again because I could not read the German translation of it that was available, social change is determined by generational change, and in particular conflict between successive generations. As the members of a given generation age, their instinct of social conservation becomes stronger, which brings them into conflict with the normal attribute of youth, innovation. This period of time helped create the framework for the way we use generations today, because for the first time in history there was a stage between childhood and adulthood, and unlike childhood, at this stage people had distinct technologies, politics, and specific events that actually affected a lot of them at the same time, which at the time was wars. It deeply influenced the way the youth at the time was thinking about the world, and made the wisdom of their parents even more outdated. Still, it wasn't until the sociologist I mentioned earlier in this video, Karl, published his essay in 1928, Das Problem der Generation, or the translation, The Problem of Generation, where he used the term generation units to refer to writers, artists, and political figures who intentionally adopted new ways of doing things and living their life. That generation theory, as we know of it, came to be born. And to explain the theory in his words, youth experiencing the same concrete historical problems may be said to be part of the same generation, except he said all of that in German. Oh, and he also assumed that the culture of peasant communities did not change. Again, his words. So you and I, fellow members of the peasant communities, because I'm assuming no 1%er is watching this video, we're not really part of this generation, or any. We're all just floating around, generationlessly. You and I, we're transcendent. We transcend all generational meaning. No meaning can define us.
The prophecy is true.
The This generational theory split into two different schools of thought. The pulse hypothesis, which believed that generational changes were the result of social and historical events, and that the youth brought new ways of thinking into the world which made old beliefs and practices obsolete. So basically, pulse hypothesis believers thought that this is how society stays the way that it is, and that generations are literally the pulse of history. And then the second generational theory is imprint hypothesis, which theorized that each generation differed from one another because they carry imprints of whatever larger historical event they had grown up witnessing. So according to them, change is why we have generations. And so they didn't think progress is as youth-driven as the pulse theory believers thought it was. The way we think of generations today has aspects from both the pulse hypothesis and the imprint hypothesis. When we talk about generations being impacted by huge historical events that happened when they were young, like World War II, the Vietnam War, 9/11, and COVID, we kind of ascribe to the imprint hypothesis way of thinking. But then we do often also say that the youth drives culture through their distinct tastes, values, and ways of being that often become mainstream by displacing the culture that came before them. So when we do that, we are ascribing to the pulse hypothesis school of thought. And this is why I think it's so important for us to understand the role of the way we define youth in the development of our ideas of generation and cringe. What we think of as mainstream culture is so often defined by the people who are the youth at the time, platforming their ideas and borrowing from the ideas, values, and distinctive characteristics of the youth who came before them and aged out of that 30-year cycle. And this is what we're seeing now with Gen Z becoming more of the main youth group and millennials aging out of it. Young millennials, though, are still technically under 30 at the time of this video being filmed, but a majority of them are over 30. Also, spoiler alert for another section of this video, but this will also end up happening to Gen Z when Gen Alpha grows up and becomes the dominant group within the youth cycle. This can also explain how our ideas of cringe towards different generations develop over time, but more about that in the next section. Also, just a quick breakdown of all the generations mentioned in this video. We currently have defined the following generations. And also, this is from a super American perspective, so if you're not American or from the United States, your country might be defining generations differently. So just a little disclaimer about that. Here are the generations. The lost generation, which were people born from 1882 to 1900s. They fought in World War I and grew into adulthood during the roaring 20s. Then the greatest generation, or GI generation, which included people who were born between 1901 to 1927 and who came into adulthood during the Great Depression and fought in World War II. Then there was the silent generation, or the lucky generation, who were the people who were born between 1928 and 1945. They fought in the Korean War, and some of them also fought in the Vietnam War. Then there was baby boomers, or boomers, who were people born between 1946 to 1964, some of who also fought during the Vietnam War, and who participated in a lot of anti-establishment, cultural, and political movements of the 60s and the 70s. Next is Gen X, or the baby bust generation, who were born between 1965 and 1980s. They participated in a lot of subcultures and countercultures. Then there were the Millennials, or Gen Y, who were born between 1981 and 1996 and had a childhood without the internet, and most of who remember 9/11. And then there's Gen Z, or Zoomers, who were born between 1997 and 2012. And we're the first generation to grow up with the internet and experience rapid technological changes when we were still in single-digit numbers. And then finally, we have Generation Alpha, or Gen Alpha, who started to be born around 2012 and are still being born today, but are predicted to only count till the middle of the 2020s. So maybe until 2025. Now let's move on to our exploration of cringe generationally. Millennials. They're the one generation that apparently we as Gen Z have a lot to say about, and also apparently a lot to make fun about. I've seen an endless amount of TikToks and read so many tweets and articles by millennials complaining that Gen Z was coming for them because of their side parts, skinny jeans, love for Harry Potter, fact that they call flare leggings, yoga pants, and I'm just here to tell you, if you enjoy any of those things, no one is coming for them. No one is coming for you. Like truly, even though it may seem so on the internet, if you just keep your phone down and go outside, no one will care. Even Gen Z outside will not care. But also, despite saying that, I cannot completely say that there aren't some members of Gen Z disparaging millennials for doing those things. There are. There's a ton of reactionary content out there of Gen Z making fun of millennials. But I don't think that's because millennials are inherently not cool. It's just that all of these things were popular for a significant amount of time and given plenty of cultural attention for a while. We almost became overexposed to all of it. Journalist Constance Grady, in her article titled "Why So Much Obama-Era Pop Culture Feels So Cringe Now" on Vox, explained that part of the reason why we think things like adults debating what Hogwarts house they belong to or hashtagging are cringy right now is all part of the declined experience as a simple response to overexposure. She says that, and I will be quoting, they've all reached a level of cultural saturation that made them inescapable, and a backlash inevitably followed. Over time, something that is popular gets so overexposed that it becomes almost too mainstream, and as a result, it becomes cringy or uncool because too many people are doing it. So people begin to stop liking it or thinking that it's cringe. Now, when millennials were younger, back during the dawn of the internet, cringe was also being used as the main currency for online exchange through memes and one-liners. But that was like until the late 2010s. After that, it started to be used to mock the generation that came before us. Rachel Jennings, the senior correspondent at Vox for social platforms and the creator economy, says that the reason why this happened is more than just the fact that the millennials got older. She says that the internet got bigger and easier to join. Algorithms defined more of what we saw and did on it. Groups of people learned how to wield irony as a weapon on a macro scale. The pace at which culture evolved sped up so that only those who spent all their time online could parse through the layers. And I think the older you get, the less time you have available to spend online, which maybe is why so many millennials became cringy, because when they got to spend more time online, the internet culture was different and they tend to remember those as opposed to what it's evolved into today, which is much more different than what it was, say, 10 years ago, when a lot more millennials probably were online more frequently. I also think another thing that a lot of people are forgetting is that the mainstream culture millennials created was experienced by Gen Z when the oldest members of it had just become teenagers. And anything you've experienced a whole lot when you're smaller or did when you were younger tends to become uncool when you're older. Like a 16-year-old is not going to think the same thing that they thought when they were 12 was cool is cool now too. There are rare exceptions to this, of course. We do this because our sense of who we are is changing as we're growing up, and we're trying to grow away from the identity that we had as children that oftentimes is informed by where we're growing up, our families, what we're told to do, or what entertainment we were exposed to, or what was popular when we were small. This is also why the people who tend to deem whether things are cringy or not cringy tend to be teenagers and 20-something-year-olds. They're dictating what pop culture looks like, but they're also actively trying to shape their identity and figure out who they are. These are both periods of time in your life, and you're just trying to figure out what your place in the world is going to look like and who you are. And this is also the period of your life when you're going through a whole lot of change and trying not to be the person you were when you were a preteen. So when Gen Z was younger, they were wearing their hair in side parts and they were wearing skinny jeans. And of course, as they grow older, they're going to think that's cringe because that's just what they did when they were small. And like I said earlier, the definition of youth is now being applied to Gen Z, and the barriers of entering this group is usually pretty heavily guarded by marketers who want to incentivize those who don't fit into this group to try to do so by buying their products. What What, Gen Z doesn't think your skinny jeans are cool? Buy these low-waisted baggy ones that we're selling right now with this discount code. What, Gen Z thinks your slang is cheugy? Watch these videos, spend more time on our social media platforms, and be exposed to the lingo that Gen Z is using to find out how you can change that and no longer be cheugy. What, Gen Z thinks your makeup is outdated and so 2016? Don't worry, buy our makeup products to help them know that you are so 2024. What, Gen Z thinks you look a little too old? Don't worry, let us inject Botox on your face, which yes, you'll have to come in every few months to upkeep, otherwise your skin will start to sag and you will suddenly start to look significantly older than you naturally did. And then you'll be the face of youth in no time. And then Gen Z will think you're one of them. Companies spend so much money on marketing and consultants to find out different ways to make people feel like they're old, when dead ass they're just 30 years old. Which, if we're assuming you're gonna live till you're 100, that's just 30% of your life. And honestly, personally, if I see a loading icon and it just says 30%, I never think that's a lot. I'm still like, oh, that's still an earlier stage. Like 30 is still young. It is definitely not old, or even as old as these marketers will have you believe, or old at all. But it's just very profitable for them to have you think this way. But also, all of this is exactly the reason why Gen Alpha is going to eventually grow up and think Gen Z is cringe too. Because the parts of Gen Z culture that are mainstream now are what Gen Alpha is growing up with. And they'll want to move away from these identities and form their own generational identity with time too. They have so much to choose from when they're picking what is cringy about Gen Z. The broccoli haircuts, the unironic thirst traps, the way so many of us overshare on TikTok. And even though I love this one, I absolutely know someone in the future is going to have a lot of opinions about maximalism and the Pinterest girl look. I mean, the microtrend supervillain final boss is already becoming a thing. Also, these marketing execs and consultants are going to start gatekeeping youth from us too. And then we'll be doing the exact same thing millennials are doing right now when they talk about Gen Z. Actually, correct that. I've already started seeing some people doing that to Gen Alpha already. It's natural for times to change. It's also natural for generations to find the ones who came before them cringy. It's all part of their way of figuring out who they are. It's like when you're a teenager and your parents or your teachers think something is cool, you're going to automatically think it's cringe just because they thought it was cool. It's all part of the same phenomena. Now that that's been established, what about the way older generations look down at younger generations? What happens to cringe there? Welcome back, ladies, gentlemen, and gentle days. Today I'm going to tell you a few quotes, and you tell me what year you think they were from. Ready? Okay, let's go. Quote number 1. What really distinguishes this generation from those before it is that it's the first generation in American history to live so well and complain so bitterly about it. What year was this quote said? Any guesses?
Last year?
Nope. This quote was from an article titled Boring 20s that was written in 1993. Here's quote number 2. A few 35-year-old friends just now are leaving their parents' nest. Many friends are getting married or having a baby for the first time. They aren't switching occupations because they have finally landed a meaningful career. Perhaps after a decade of hopscotching jobs in search of an identity, they're doing the kinds of things our society used to expect from 25-year-olds. What generation was this quote said about?
Was this about millennials?
This was published in 1984's Wall Street Journal in an article titled Not Ready for Middle Age at 35. Here's quote number 3. Is it just me, or are student competencies like basic writing skills in serious peril today? Teachers have been reporting anecdotally that even compared to 5 years ago, many are seeing declines in vocabulary, grammar, writing, and analysis. Any guesses as to which year this is from?
Okay, that has to be from this year. Isn't everyone complaining about how Gen Alpha can't write?
Good guess, but nope. This quote is from an article titled Why Can't College Students Write Anymore? That appeared in Psychology Today in 2014. That's a decade ago.
So this problem has been going on for a while. People have been criticizing the youth for a very long time, huh?
Yeah, basically for as long as the concept has existed. We've all heard our elders say things like, "You kids these days will never know how hard we had it." which is also known as the kids these days phenomena. Or we've heard them call our generation lazy, and they tell this to us even though the exact same thing was happening to their generation when they were our age. To prove it, here's a quote that appeared in Falkirk Herald's article titled Scottish Rights of Way. More young people should use them in 1951. This is what the writer said. Many young people were so pampered nowadays that they had forgotten that there was such a thing as walking, and they made automatically for the buses. Unless they did something, the future for walking was very poor indeed. In 1951, the author was worried about the youth of their day destroying the walking industry because they used public transit. Oh god, public transportation for everybody? Whoever is gonna walk? Our legs are in danger. People have hated the younger generation since the dawn of time. But is there any validity to these claims? Have things really gotten worse with each successive generation? In 2019, John Protzko and Jonathan W. Schooler wanted to explore this very idea. Specifically, they wanted to see what the kids these days phenomena meant and why people always thought the youth of today seemed to lack qualities that they used to have when they were their age. They conducted 5 different studies on 3,458 Americans between the ages of 33 and 51. For the first 3 studies, the participants were asked to rank today's kids on 3 traits: their respect for authority, their intelligence level, and their enjoyment of reading. For studies 4 and 5, Protzo and Schooler tried to change the adult notions of how good they were at reading and their own intelligence level by having them predict their level of interest in reading as a child, their childhood friends' level of interest in reading as a child, their current level was, and then also administering author recognition tests and randomly ranking them. What they found is that the kids these days phenomena came from our memories not being as reliable as we thought they were, and also us projecting our biases. Specifically, the bias of presentism, which is when we take pieces of our present and apply them to memories of our past. Specifically, what they found was that the higher a person ranked themselves on their reading level, their intelligence, their respect for authority, the lower they rated today's youth on those very traits. But the scientists also found that when these adults took the test and then the scientists ranked their scores low, that then the adults would actually rate today's children as doing better on those traits. According to John Protzko, and I will be quoting, people that aren't very intelligent or aren't very well read or don't respect authority, they tend not to think kids are so bad. And actually in this paper, both of the scientists concluded their findings with this statement. While people may believe in general decline, they also believe that children are especially deficient on the traits in which they excel. The people who rated themselves as highly on their respect for authority ranked today's youth as lacking that trait, and the people who rated themselves as very well read also rated these youth as being low on these traits. And also when they did the study 4 and 5 and asked these adults to compare their reading level with their childhood friends and then the kids of today, they found that people were also making mistakes by incorrectly assuming today's kids are less accomplished in things like reading than kids of the past, which actually isn't true. Literacy rates have been on the increase globally with each successive generation. According to Protzko, people in their 20s and 30s are going to grow up looking at kids and think they're deficient. And this happens because we don't actually have a very accurate memory of what things were like when we were growing up, or even what we were like when we were growing up. Because in Protzko's words, we are imposing our current self on the past. And he also said something very interesting about presentism, which is basically our memories of our relationships are dependent on the way we currently feel about the people, and not how we've historically felt about them. He explained this by saying, your memory for how much food you've eaten in the last 2 weeks can be colored by whether I've given you food to eat now, or if I make you go into the lab hungry, which I think is very cool, but also very disconcerting. The study is concluded with this sentence: when observing current children, we compare our biased memory to the present and a decline appears. This may explain why the kids these days effect has been happening for millennia. You know what's really interesting about the story? It's the reason why John Protzko decided to conduct the study psychology in the first place. He became interested in the kids these days phenomena after he spoke and surveyed a few of the top experts in developmental psychology and found that their own biases about youth at the time wasn't quite backed up with what the data was telling him. See, in 2017, he had been looking at this massive 60 years worth of kid scores on tests that measured their patience level and their ability to resist short-term pleasure in order to get long-term, more lasting reward, aka delayed gratification. While he was looking at these numbers, he also asked 260 developmental psychologists whether or not they predicted over time these kids' scores were improving or getting worse. Now, these people were the leading voices in developmental psychology at the time. Surely they would have a good grasp on what the trend was here. Well, about 84% of the experts predicted that the kids' scores were getting worse with time, or that it was just staying constant, which was incorrect. The data set that Protzko had been looking at actually showed that over time, kids were getting better at being patient and delaying their reward or gratification. Oh my god, my camera's about to die. Okay, the quality of this video might go down by a lot in a second. But continuing on, only 16% of the developmental psychologists, experts that he'd spoken to, made this correct prediction. And for Protzko, this was actually pretty surprising. And also, for me, he said this made him think, wow, even world experts who study specifically cognitive development are still like, no, kids now are objectively worse.
So, do people think the following generations are worse because they're projecting their biases and they have bad memory?
No, there are actually a few other theories. Like the one that says the reason why older generations think that the younger generations have it easier is because of the changes that come with life as you age. As you grow older, you tend to have more responsibilities compared to when you were younger. But when you see children without the same amount of responsibilities that you have when you're older, it can make you feel like they have life a lot easier than you did, especially with advances in technology and societal changes come into play. For example, older generations like the Greatest Generation and the Silent Generation had to literally survive the Great Depression and World War II, which, while successive generations did have to go fight in wars and also had their fair share of traumatizing historical events too, those two specific events might have made those who came from earlier generations feel like the younger ones had a much easier time than they did. And then all of that in conjunction with the speed at which technology has begun to advance has made a lot of things significantly easier to do over time, which means that there are some things genuinely that might be easier for younger generation to do as opposed to than it was for older generations to do when they were the same age as the younger generation. And then also there's the fact that a lot of societal changes and progress has also made life a lot better for younger people than it was for older people when they were their age. And then I also think another aspect of this is the fact that a lot of these technological changes that are happening are also a little unfamiliar for older generations because they haven't had to grow up with things like the internet, so it just takes them longer to learn about it and longer to understand how to use it, and that also might be making them anxious and make them feel like a lot of change is happening and they might not understand like why the younger generation doesn't do certain things, or it's easier for them to be able to do certain things as compared to how it was for them when they were younger. Now there's actually a term for this. Sociologist David Finkelhor defines this phenomena as juvenoia, which is the exaggerated anxiety about the influence of social change on children and youth. Another thing is, as much social progress is happening, there might be some people in the older generation who don't completely understand the social progress or the need for it. And so for them, it might seem like a lot of change that is happening with the younger generation, and the younger generation might be getting more soft and yada yada.
When I was younger, you'd wait weeks for your letter to get a reply. Now you young people just need to send a text out.
Wait, how old are you? I could have sworn you were born in 2020.
It's also unfair to judge younger generations on norms that were normal for older generations, but may be outdated and sometimes even illegal now.
Yeah, there's been a total shift in the way children are raised and what ideas have become normalized to them in just the last half century. According to Dr. Carl Nassar, a therapist and researcher who specializes in the impact of culture on our individual and collective well-being, and I will be quoting, "Prior generations were taught to repress instead of express, but for newer generations, it's the other way around. That's caused a perceptual rift, with older generations seeing this expression as a sign of weakness, because they were taught that vulnerability is a weakness and not a strength." He thinks that the reason why so many members of older generations today think that the younger generations are snowflakes or weak is because of this mismatch in how we express our problem. Transparent, honest communication has become a lot more accepted in recent years. So maybe a lot of what these older generations are seeing as snowflakey or needy or weak could also just be us expressing a new norm and them not really understanding it.
I also think this contributes to the way a lot of older generations don't fully understand why some younger generations advocate for social change, because so many of them were taught to repress, hide parts of your identity that people don't understand, and just conform to what you're supposed to be like. And I feel like because of that, a lot of them don't understand why people might not want to do that and why we're asking for social change. I think that could also be contributing to this whole kids have it easier, kids are weak, the kids are delusional vibes, you know? Also, one argument I've been hearing so many times from members of older generation is to name the rising rates of depression and anxiety amongst Gen Z as a reason as to why we're snowflakes. Also, fun fact, we're the most depressed and anxious generation around. Yay! Yay, we're finally number one in something. What they fail to take into account here is that a lot of us came into adulthood during a global pandemic, economic uncertainty, and insecurity, and the advent and normalization of social media has made loneliness a very, very big issue. Also, social isolation was not only normalized for us, it was also necessary because of the pandemic. According to Jason Dorsey, president for the Center of Generation Kinetics, which is a generation research firm. I didn't know those existed. It's kind of cool to hear how much niche stuff there is out there. But he says this: "The reality is that Gen Z is coming of age facing a variety of challenges that other generations have not faced at the same life stage, most notably the COVID-19 pandemic and the always-on pressure of social media directly to their smartphone. Add in the mental health challenges of social distancing and isolation during the pandemic, distance learning challenges, and all the formative elements of young adulthood, and it's easy to see why the generation is feeling like it's a challenging time." Also, I think a lot of older generations are forgetting that economically times are really, really challenging right now and very different than what they were before. When a lot of boomers were entering early adulthood, there was widespread economic prosperity, which meant that a lot of them could afford to buy houses on jobs that didn't pay that much. Well, for a lot of Gen Z and even millennials, when we came into adulthood, the housing market looked a lot more different and was a lot more expensive than it was for the older generations. And we also have to deal with stagnating wages, which means that we can now afford a lot less with the same wages that the boomers were able to buy McMansions with. And we also have a lot less job security than they did. Gone are the days when people can work at the same company for 30, 40 years. That's not a thing anymore. When baby boomers were younger, you could get a middle-class job without a degree in some places, and they also didn't have the extreme amount of student debt that people have now.
Back in my day, you could get a 2-story house for just $7,000.
Again, how old are you exactly? Because last I remember, no house was $7,000 in 2021.
Another theory on why this happens is by professor at George Mason University, Tyler Cohen, who said that parents who invest their time, effort, and emotional energy into raising their children may react with extreme vigor against forces that counteract such an important part of their life program. And he thinks this is why, again, the very same individuals tend to adopt cultural optimism when they're young and cultural pessimism once they have children.
Basically, what Cohen is saying here is that cultural generational critics and parents have passed their adventure window, which is a time in which people are more willing to try new things and experiment with new forms of culture. He says that this window closes after certain key points in our life, after which we pretty much become set in our ways. And this is described very well by Douglas Adams, the writer of Hitchhiker's Guide to Galaxy, and I will be quoting, "Anything that is in the world when you're born is normal normal and ordinary, and is just a natural part of the way the world works. Anything that's invented between when you're 15 and 35 is new and exciting and revolutionary, and you can probably get a career in it. Anything invented after you're 35 is against the natural order of things.
This fear of change is probably what's making people overact, but something they need to remember is that just because there are new things and new progress as they're growing older, that doesn't mean the values and common sense that have helped them so much in the past will not continue to do so in the future. And also that the complaints they make about kids these days were the exact same complaints leveraged against them too.
That's true. While researching for this video, I found an endless amount of quotes across centuries that all accuse the youth of the time as being lazy, entitled, self-serving, and not as intelligent as the generations that came before them.
Also, some of the differences between generations may not be characteristic of them, but instead might be more characteristic of the age that people are at. Maybe younger people seem more self-centered and narcissistic because they have less commitments and responsibilities, while older people may seem more set in their ways because they have had more time to cement them and figure out what they like and what they don't like.
Yeah, that's a good point. According to Kurt Rudolph, an industrial and organizational psychologist and professor at Wayne State University in Detroit, and I will be quoting, people tend to make these overgeneralized statements about generations and try to build a narrative around the idea that there are differences that we observe among people that we can attribute to generations. But what we know about that is that it's much more complicated. He said that when generations complain about each other, we participate in something called as generationalism, which is a general bias or prejudice against a group of people based on when they were born, which isn't the best thing to do because one thing about humans is that we are very diverse. Even within groups that seem homogenous or might seem to have similar backgrounds, there's still a lot of diversity to completely generalize us like this. In fact, even when I was talking about how good baby boomers had it, I was kind of generalizing too, because truthfully, only the baby boomers born between 1946 and 1952 entered adulthood during a time of economic prosperity. For younger boomers born between 1953 and 1964, the economy was actually really bad, and it took them a lot longer to get a job, to buy a house, and to do a lot of things that we assume boomers had an easier time doing. Again, here I'm not saying that they had it harder than we did, because their wages were still better than they are today. And that actually brings me to something very, very important. This whole time, I've been talking about Gen Z, and how as the youngest current adult generation, we're impacted by a lot of bias and preconceived notions. But soon, we won't be the youngest generation in adulthood. And like the millennials do to us, will we be perpetuating generationalism on young Gen Alpha too? Now, after watching this video, you might be inclined to say, no, we won't do that. But I've actually already begun to see traces of it happen online, from people making fun of Gen Alpha memes, to them making fun of their literacy rate, to also people making fun and making TikToks pretending to be Gen Alpha. It almost seems like we're forgetting that they're just children reacting to a society and culture much different than the one we grew up in. There's like basically no third spaces for them anymore that are easy to walk to, like parks or malls. And there's so much consumerism on apps like TikTok that are always being pushed to the front of people's news feeds to promote TikTok Shop. And then also, COVID caused schools to shift online and close, which already had a massive impact for Gen Z. But for Gen Alpha, a lot of them were in pivotal moments of their childhood. They were in primary school and kindergarten when it happened, and I can't even imagine the ways in which it probably impacted their socialization, education, and how technology got even more normalized in every part of their lives. Also, as a result of all of this, they probably had to develop different ways to cope with this, which might have caused for different trends and norms and values to develop. And I think we need to have more compassion for them about these things. Like, I've already seen TikToks making fun of how Gen Alpha can't really spell, which seems so reminiscent of the quote I showed earlier that was actually targeted to Gen Z. And like, I've also seen some stuff about how people think Gen Alpha has weird memes like Skibidi Toilet. And you know, I'll say, I don't understand Skibidi Toilet. at all, but I don't think I'm supposed to understand it. Like, that's not meant for me, and that's fine. It's meant for Gen Alpha at the current age level they're at, and that makes sense because they're children. Like, I truly hope we do not perpetuate the exact same thing to Gen Alpha that's being perpetuated onto us. Here's a cartoon from the 1950s edition of Life magazine by cartoonist Bill Maudlin. He made this to go along with his article. He defended his generation, the greatest generation, against those who came before them and who were critical of them for lacking some of that good old American gambling spirit and enterprise. This fear developed later, since initially the older generation was critical towards the greatest generation because they were worried that these young soldiers fighting in foreign land might bring back foreign radical ideas, as Maudlin recalls it. Now, this cartoon is so interesting to me. It's 80 years old and still so relevant today. This time, instead of looking forward, the younger generation almost seems to be looking back at the previous generation and judging them too. Where the older ones look at us with distrust, we turn back around and leverage cringe as our defensive weapon here. But the bad thing about cringe is that eventually the same people who throw it defensively at other people will eventually become the people who are labeled with it as well. In the end, we all become cringe, whether we like it or not. And that's actually why I think it's so important for us to detach ourselves from this idea that we need to do whatever we can to not be cringe. Like that meme that went around a few years ago of the cow in the sea. We might become cringe, but at least we will be free. Be the cow from that picture. If we don't, I genuinely fear we'll end up becoming Steve Buscemi from that meme. Hello, fellow kids. Like, I just don't want to be 40 years old trying to use a younger generation slang. That's for them. I'll let them keep that as a capsule of the time that they're in. I'll be 40. I'm sure I'll have more things to worry about and to deal with than looking cool in front of a demographic that's going through such a time of self-discovery. Also, I'm pretty sure I'll look even cringier trying to use the younger generation slang than I would be just using slang from my time. Detaching ourselves from our fear of cringe is so important for us to live longer, happier lives. Because this fear of being cringe and also judging younger generations at its core comes from our own fear of growing older, of growing irrelevant, of growing unimportant, of growing unfamiliar and unable to cope with the changes happening in the world around us. And I think that's because so many of us have attached our value to our generation and so much of our identity to those things too. And so I think it's best that we separate ourselves from this fear of being cringe by simply accepting ourselves and also the fact that we're gonna grow old and that's okay, and we're gonna grow cringe and that is also okay. We need to accept that the world will change in ways that it's gonna look so much different than it did when we were children, but that at the end of the day, that's okay. It's okay that you eventually won't know who the singers are making the top 10 most streamed songs. It's okay that you won't understand the slang all the young people are using. It's okay that eventually you're gonna grow old. It's really natural for these things to happen, and I feel like the ones in the older generation who end up okay are the ones who grow okay with the fact that these things are gonna happen. I also think we forget what incredible privilege it is to grow older and to watch our loved ones grow older as well. Not all of us are gonna get to enjoy it, so I think we should start recognizing it for the privilege that it will eventually become. Honestly, I think it's gonna be so nice to grow away from mainstream culture. Like, just imagine the amount of real estate space in your head that's gonna be free when you aren't thinking about what's popular anymore, or like what's going on, or what's in trend, or what's the cool newest slang word someone's using, what's cheugy, and if you fit that definition. Like, I can't imagine growing older and still caring about what people I don't know think about me or expect from me. If I had to constantly conform to popular ideas of what was considered the norm and what was considered cool for my entire life, I assume that's not going to be very fulfilling, you know? Because when I'm 50 and I probably just want to like chill at home and have like a slow, quiet days, you know, a 20-something-year-old is not going to think that's cool. And that makes sense for the age that they're in, but I probably don't want to go out and party with them. Like, I'll probably want to stay home, and that'll probably be very healthy for my body. And that's why I think it's like, okay for us to have different ideas of what is cool and what is mainstream and what we should want to do with our time. Like, I can't imagine living a life being afraid of being cringe all the time. Even when I'm like 60, it's going to be very fulfilling.
And you'd have to stop talking to me all the time and talking for me.
Imagine that. Also, being cringe is not only a generationally subjective thing, but it's also individually so dependent on one person's perspective, who is perceiving you, and changes between people's perspective so rapidly. Like, I can't imagine a life spent trying to fit into everyone's ideal of non-cringe would be very fulfilling or even possible. The definition of cringe is just a subset of human opinion, and we know that that's an incredibly fickle thing to try to live your life by. You just can't live your life trying to satisfy every opinion that anyone that has ever perceived you has had. Like, sometimes I see cool old people who don't care at all about what other people think about them, and there's probably some of them out there who don't even know what that means or care to know what that means, and they seem so fulfilled, and I'm just like, damn, I want to be like that. Like, I want to be the kooky old lady that's just doing my thing with chicken by my side and probably a million other cats. Honestly, I don't even want to wait for that long to be the eccentric old cat lady. I can really do that right now. I can just be kooky with chicken by my side right now.
You voiced me now, so you might already be on your way to that.
I know this part might kind of sound like a Disney Channel movie ending, with its lesson at the end being like, be yourself and you'll be happy. Love yourself. But truly, I think when it comes to learning how to detach ourselves from caring about being cringe and how to stop this generational war that will probably come our way in one direction or the other, accepting the fact that you're going to grow old and accepting who you are is kind of the best way to go about it and stop those things from impacting us. Also, I will say, while this video focuses purely on how cringe works across generations, there's much to be said about the way it usually targets those who don't have social power, who aren't deemed as favorable, people who might have a disability, people who don't fit Eurocentric standards of beauty, or Western ideas or societal expectations of how they're supposed to be or how their accents are supposed to sound. Cringe almost seems to be a repackaged way to establish social order when it's used that way. And when it's used against generations that come before us, it's almost like a tool of self-defense against our fear of change, but also a way for others to conform to the societies that we are familiar with. Which is why I think to be okay with cringe, we need to eventually accept change. And also remember that those who were cringe before were the ones calling others cringe at some point of time. Or as Margaret A. Blanchard, a journalist and professor, puts it, parents and grandparents who led the efforts to cleanse today's society seem to forget that they survived alleged attacks on their morals by different media when they were children. Each generation's adults either lose faith in the ability of their young people to do the same, or they become convinced that the dangers facing the new generation are much more substantial than the ones they faced as children. So it's like, when older people are judging you or leveraging things against you, just remember this is probably coming from their own trauma and their own inability to accept change or understand that the world's gonna change and be different than what they're familiar with. That's also okay. Society evolves just the way humans evolve. And also, another thing to remember, like I said a few times before, economy and marketing professionals have genuine incentive to make you feel like you're cringe for growing old and continuing to exhibit your generational identifiers. The more insecure you grow about these things, the more money they can make. It truly shouldn't matter to you as an adult if a middle schooler thinks you're cringy, because trust me, they will, regardless of whether or not you are. Being cool is traditionally a trait left to the young or the youth of the time. Cringe will eventually be the fate of all those who grow old. This is a completely natural process and nothing we should be ashamed of. And that is all, folks. That is my exploration of the crime of being cringe and the generational war. Thank you so much for watching. I have used, let me tell you, there's an insane amount of citations in this video. 55 citations in this video. My entire script process was 66 pages, which is insane. If anyone has a good recommendation on how I can include all my citations, please let me know, because I used to include them in the bio of the video, but I usually hit the character limit before they even get to halfway through the citations, and I'm like, I can include them in a comment down below, but I'm worried about whether or not that might get lost sometimes. Like, I can pin it, but what if I have something else I need to say? Like, how does that work? So if anyone has a suggestion, please do send it my way. As always, thank you so much for watching. So thank you so much for 1,000 subscribers. Thank you. I didn't even know I could hit that number. I couldn't even conceptually think of 1,000 subscribers. 1K? That is crazy. Y'all, 1K is a lot. It is insane. Thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate this, and I truly hope I continue to make things that are worthy of your support. Thank you again for all the kind comments in my last video and for the likes and people being so sweet. I really appreciate that. I definitely took into consideration the volume of my background music in this video, so I hope it is low enough that y'all can hear my voice and that it's not too distracting. I appreciate all of you so much. If you like this video, please consider subscribing to me because that is very encouraging. And also, please do leave a comment if this video, resonated with you, or if you have other thoughts regarding it. I would love to hear your thoughts. And one like to this video equates to one more person in every generation growing away from the idea of cringe. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you very soon with another video. Bye!